Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Ford, and welcome to the Purple Podcast. Here we talk about all things corporate innovation. We have an amazing new series coming up for you guys that we can't wait to share. It's all about failure. Failure is a big thing in innovation. We think we can learn so much from it. We've lined up an amazing set of guests to come talk to us about failure. They're willing to lay their failures on the line and tell us what they've learned about it. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this edition of the Purple Podcast. We are commencing our series on failure. It's a wonderful word, failure. At Gelify, we believe that failure is not necessarily a bad thing. It's got a bad rep. And I want to take us through a bit of a series speaking to corporate leaders across the region to get a sense of the fact that failure is not always bad. It can sometimes actually be good. It's a hard thing to talk about. So I really appreciate our next guest coming on today's show. It's Brandon Rowberry, who's the CEO of Aster DM Healthcare. Brandon, thanks very much for joining us.
Neil, it's great to be here. Failure is part of my middle name, I think. So
Excellent. I'm not sure whether that is a good thing or
no,
not.
it's okay. It's okay.
So listen, maybe if you could just give us a sense of what it is that you're doing, how long you've been here, how did you come to the UAE?
Sure. So I came to the UAE at first in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
We moved here originally to work for the sovereign wealth fund ADIA, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. Worked there for 4 or 5 years, and then got the great opportunity to take the CEO role at Aster in 2021, and have been up here in Dubai ever since.
Very cool. So you didn't get to where you got to without, I guess, a long career along the way of ups and downs. No failure?
Lots of failure, actually.
Okay, lay it on me. I want to know.
Both personally and professionally, right?
Well, let's focus on the professional.
On the professional
side.
Okay.
You don't have to name names because I'm aware that the concept of failure is not necessarily nice to talk about.
Yeah.
You don't have to lay the blame on companies or anything like that. But what I would love to understand is maybe if you can bring to life an example or two of failure that you've experienced along the way. And then maybe think about what you've learned from that, because I will come back to that, because as I say, at Gelify, we do think that failure is not necessarily a bad thing. We have an adage that if you're innovating, you need to be failing somewhere along the way. Okay, so if you're embarking on corporate innovation, we think, and this is a bit of a social experiment, but we think that you have to fail along the way. So with that in mind, I'd love to hear about an example of yours.
Yeah, sure. And in some ways, we're birds of a feather. Before a couple of roles ago, I was the head of innovation for a couple of major corporations, right? So I understand that the innovation process, the gates that we have in the way to kind of keep those failures rather small before they become something gigantic that crashes the organization. But sure, plenty of options for failure. We hopefully like to call it learning, but honestly, sometimes it just is failure. So let me give you an example. One of my first kind of big roles as I was younger, but my first role as a director in a major Fortune 500 company, right? And I was working for the leadership team. So you got the CEO, the head of sales, and all the big guys, and I'm supposed to be running the process of innovation. And one of the failure modes in corporate innovation is this sort of thing around pet projects of some senior leader X that they know is going to work. And therefore, they tend to bypass all of the wonderful innovation process that you've put in place.
That's boring.
Because they know it's going to work. And it's only because you haven't done it hard enough or you don't have enough data. And so there was this one time when the head of sales, so someone a couple rungs above me in the organization, still fairly young, but thought I was maybe big stuff back then, he had this great idea. And naturally, because he had the great idea, one of our innovation teams had to take it up and do it. So we did. We allocated some resources to it. Went small at first, right? Creating the MVP and all those great things you're supposed to do in the innovation process, and worked it for a number of months, and just didn't seem to be working. But that's okay. We can pivot, right? We can change. We can do something a little bit differently. Continue to do that. I would check in with the innovation team on a weekly basis and see it just every time we went around those iterations, it wasn't working. So every month I would come back to the quote innovation council of the organization, right? And say, here's how things are going, and project X, project Y, et cetera, in your funnel. Project Z doesn't seem to be working out so much, and here's the reasons why. Well, Mr. Head of Sales spoke up and just says, well, I'm not sure I believe that data. Have you guys tried X, Y, and Z? We're like, well, we haven't tried X, but we've tried these other two things. And so we continue down the process, allocating more time, more resources, et cetera. The failure was in me not standing up when it got down to gate 3 or 4 or 5 and saying, I'm just going to stop it now.
Yeah.
Right? So that's on me as the leader of innovation in the organization, not understanding enough, maybe a bit too much naivete, but also then I had wasted company resources. I had wasted people's time, regardless of who had the idea. I think this happens in organizations quite a bit.
Yep.
It's happened to me since, and the fortunate thing is I didn't make that mistake again. Meaning, you've been part of another organization, big leader X has a pet project, happy to take it up. I mean, there's so many we get now and in the past where you get a WhatsApp or article X says this, or they were just at a conference and you should just be doing this. And you want to try those things out, but they have to follow the same process as everything else.
So in that instance, were you obviously, you said that you didn't cut it short when you should have.
Correct. Yeah. Spent way too much time and way too many resources in the company where we had some big opportunity costs. We couldn't do other things.
Was there a part of you that was trying to make it work though as well?
Of course.
Because of...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was trying to make it work because that's what you do for the leaders who say you're going to make it work.
Yeah. It will work.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, it will work. I had known from some of my background in the past, I didn't know if it did. I had some doubts about it. I wasn't strong enough about expressing those doubts. Personal failure, right?
Yeah.
But it was something that the company lost money on, too much significant, and lost time and cost, and somewhat to a degree of you lose some of your employees' confidence in what you're doing because you're doing things that aren't working.
I'm curious, what was the output of that from both from a personal sense in your positioning in the corporate and the company perspective? Was it looked on as a failure by the head of sales? Was he personally annoyed?
It was looked on by failure by the head of sales.
Yeah.
He was personally annoyed. On the flip side, though, out of that process, I actually developed a better relationship with him than I had at first. He was probably the biggest detractor of innovation in the company anyway. He was one of those guys that had been there for 28 years.
I know best.
Right. And I got it. We just do this harder and you're just not doing it this way. But to his credit, he'd also led the company through some pretty tremendous growth. Mm-hmm. And so in listening to him, there are some key steps that I did wrong in the process. I maybe didn't involve some of his key lieutenants in that change management process that you do as part of innovation. But when we had to go, we had to take some write-offs. The board had to be made aware that this went a certain direction and kind of had to fall on the sword for that one.
Did he take any learnings from it as well? Do you know?
I hope so. It's hard to tell. I mean, we got a little bit closer, but then he ended up leaving the organization maybe a year after that. So
okay,
not as much time.
not connected to
Not connected
your
to
project.
this. Not connected to this. No, something else.
Very cool. That's super interesting, Brandon. I think we've all been in positions where we've kind of been told to toe the line and you want to do the best and you can't necessarily do that in a corporate sense. Sometimes it's the processes, sometimes it's the stakeholder management. Maybe are there any in this world of innovation, anything from a more personal perspective that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think a lot of innovators, particularly corporate innovators who want to get in there and they're willing to stick their necks out for what they think is doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's really hard because the innovation, it's kind of on again and off again. Sometimes in companies, it's, they hire up real quick for innovation and then all of a sudden they fire and lay off for innovation. I've been part of that cycle as well. I've personally been laid off where I don't think it was just me. There were a number of other people that got laid off as well, but it had to do with either a merger, an acquisition, or, company strategy changing, right?
Yeah.
And so because the company made a change in direction, all of these people got let go, myself included in that. And so you have to learn from those opportunities. And if you're going to be part of this innovation ecosystem very much in the corporation, you have to be willing to,
There's a
risk and walk out the door sometimes, right? If you're not willing to speak up very often or make your point of view there or understand that, hey, what's on again might be off again in the future.
Yeah.
That's something you want to be getting into, and probably something that the people who are watching this podcast want to know. Not that they're going to be wary of, right? Not that you're going to be afraid of doing that.
Yeah.
But that's reality, particularly when it comes to corporate innovation.
Did you want to stay when that happened? Did you want to stay in the innovation field?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I did.
Okay. Why was that?
Because it's just something that I had learned to love and learned to do, and I thought you could create major change, not just for the companies, but the sort of the betterment of other human beings and society and others. Because the breakthrough nature of innovation is really where the big step changes are made.
Yep.
And for me, it's not about just the incremental; it's about the sort of the blitz scaling of things and ramping them up. And I'm willing to take the personal risk of saying those things might not work out, which means personally for me, they also might not work out there, but you got to have faith that there's going to be that next opportunity, whether you create it or you're building it in another corporation.
I'm curious, do you think companies are improving with failure or the concept of failure?
That's a good question, because I gave a talk on this probably a decade ago. And I'm not sure there's been a ton of movement in that. There's been a lot more literature come out in the last 20, 25 years about that, sort of the acceptance of it. There's also the cultural overlay on that, different regions of the world, different types of people, different corporations and how they're run. I think in some countries and cultures, it's sort of more accepted.
Yeah.
And you basically build that into your plan. And in others, it's very, very much not.
Yeah.
So I think the answer is it depends on which area, which culture, et cetera, you're talking about. Some of the regions we're in, it's a little tougher.
Yeah.
Right. And in others, it's a bit more easy.
I have a theory that that the word is often great.
Yeah.
They understand the concept of failure, but actually when it happens, it's a different story.
Yeah. It stings.
Yeah.
It's not so much.
Yeah. If you could go back to 25-year-old Brandon and sit down and have a coffee with him and have a word, what would be maybe 3 key takeaways that you would pass on your knowledge to him around failure and how to maybe navigate that and what he could do kind of moving forward to set himself up for success?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would talk to younger Brandon about is be willing to walk out the door.
Yeah.
For, what you believe in, what you believe is right, and doing the right thing, because otherwise you're not going to be the best innovation type leader that you can be, right? If you're not willing to take that forward. And that's something that I had failed on earlier in that example that I brought up.
Yep.
Is that was a little too scary at the time, right? This is how I pay, this is how I feed my kids, right? Am I going to walk out the door for this? Wasn't willing to back then, but since then have. Another thing I think I would talk to younger Brandon about is just make sure that what you're going in for is worth it to you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in big corporations, this is what we do to pay for our families. But there's got to be something more that's actually into it. And there's been times in my career where I've taken the bigger paycheck, right, or the more prestigious opportunity rather than the one that probably drove me personally and passionately.
Yep.
So again, failure and not necessarily moving in the right direction. And then the third, I think, would be to be a little bit more clear about that innovation domain that you're innovating about. What is that actual thing? Yes, we let 1,000 flowers bloom, as it were. You're going to do 10 different experiments to get to that end state, but being a bit more clear and helping other people get there. Because I don't think, particularly in my younger career, I did a good enough job of really, really painting the picture, bringing everyone along in the thinking and how that's going to happen, because then it gets internalized in them. And when it's not internalized in them, it just becomes an extrinsic motivation thing.
Yeah.
And that's not going to pull you through.
Yeah. So everything that you do now, I guess, takes all of these kind of learnings into account when
hope
you
so.
roll out innovation. I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. Cool. Okay, Brandon, these are short, sharp sessions, so I could go on talking to you about this stuff all day, but I know you've got a busy day as well, so I want to
Indeed.
thank you very much for your time and talking to us about what can be a difficult subject. And yeah, thanks for talking
Thanks
to
for
us about
having
your
me.
failure.
It's been great.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thanks again.